Hey everyone, and welcome back to Creating Appealing Characters. This is week 5. This week, sculpting the hands and the feet. So by now, everyone has put in some time sculpting up their character's body and their character's face. And so all that stuff I'm sure is looking perfect and great, and we're ready to move on to some other parts of the body, specifically the hands and feet. So, hands are going to be a very important part of any character, especially if we're going to see that character printed out or ever see that character in motion. So, there's a couple notes that I want to go over in regards to hands and also feet, and just get us thinking about a couple things as we move forward into the sculpting. So, the first most important part of sculpting hands is getting reference. Surround yourself by reference. So the first and most important part of sculpting hands is getting reference, getting really good, solid reference to move forward. I really can't stress that enough. That's why I made a whole slide that just says reference. So, find some good anatomical references and diagrams. Look at actual pictures of people's hands. And of course, obviously take into consideration the concept's hands that you're working from because there's just millions of different combinations of things that go into making a hand. So it's kind of hard to predict them all here. And this is just going to be kind of a general guideline on how to sculpt hands in a good way for our characters. But yes, reference, get it, download it, put it on your other monitor, put it on your phone's lock screen so it's the first thing that you see when you wake up. Have it nearby because I'll be able to tell if you don't, and so will you. Speaking of reference, here's a couple of really good free resources for you. You can find both of these books for free online. Just search for them. Drawing the Head and Hands by Andrew Loomis is just a classic. He pretty much wrote the book on how to draw things proportionally. And it's just a very simple, straightforward approach to making a lot of stuff. All these Andrew Loomis books are great. I highly recommend them. You can find most of them for free online. George Bridgman's Constructive Anatomy book, there on the right. You can see from just these illustrations here on the front of the book, George Bridgman has a great way of going in and just really breaking down the mechanical functionality of the body in a way that is just, I find it really easy to follow along, and the shapes that he kind of pushes everything into make a lot of sense to me. But very good reference, both of these books. I highly recommend them. The hand is a character. So our hands are going to be very, very expressive extensions of our overall character. I want you to think about the hands actually as a character unto themselves. There's just so much expressiveness and articulation in each hand. In fact, as much as a full figure has. So, put the hand expressiveness together with a full figure, and you've got just character out the wazoo. So, I want to not think of our hands as sort of an afterthought and give them the amount of time and the work that they require to help pull off your character. Here's a couple examples of really nice expressive hands. These are Hogarth's hands from Iron Giant. Just have a couple images there, just some exploration. You can see how much is being conveyed with these hands. Hogarth is using his hands to tell what's going on. He's gesticulating towards things. And, there's a lot of personality that comes through, a lot of dynamic motion that comes through in these hands. So this kind of stuff is really good. Tack this up on your wall. Some characters just are straight up a hand. There's definitely enough expressiveness in a hand that you can convey a huge range of motion and sell pasta. The way that hands are used on a character sometimes is very indicative of their character, and their hand factors in a huge way. The creature on the right there, obviously, they put a lot of thought into how he should look, from the texture of his skin to the length and sharpness of those fingers. Definitely not an afterthought on a character like that. Construction. Let's talk about actually building some hands. I'm going to show you a bunch of examples from how to draw hand resources and books, and you'll notice that a lot of the types of language that's used and a lot of the information therein is very applicable to working in 3D and sculpting. So that's why I use them. Let's take a look at some of those now. any good how to draw a hand reference is almost always going to refer to the hand as a block or a wedge, when the fingers being this series of connected cube type objects. The idea is that if you can draw a cube, that you should be able to draw a hand, draw a cube in space, that is. So, and I think that that's for the most part pretty true. And it gets a little bit more complex than that, especially when we start getting into posing and all that. But the I want you to keep in mind that look of that blocky hand as we move forward, because those are going to be the main planes of our hands and our fingers, and so, sort of act as the guiding post markers for these hands as we move forward. I really like this breakdown on the right of the screen there with just a very quick gestural sort of drawing of the hand, and then a more detailed sort of a mechanical breakdown. And then the super realistic type of hand drawing there down at the bottom is maybe a little bit beyond the scope of what we're going to do in this class, but still nice to know how all of these forms build up and sort of, become an underlying structure for the more advanced looking hands. It always helps to plan out your hands this way. So just always think of them in their most simple form first, and then add that secondary and tertiary detail on top. So here we have some great blocked out hands sculpted by Philippe Farreau on the left. And we're going to use this as sort of the basis for our hand proportions as we move forward. I always keep this image up when I'm working on hands just to check my basic proportions and make sure that everything's lining up the best that it can. But there's some good general guidelines that I want to go over using this hand as my example. The first being that the whole hand has got a very clear paddle type of shape to it. The whole thing feels like a contained unit, which is going to be kind of one of the themes of this week. It's got its own self-contained shape to it. Now, when we get into actually measuring distances, it's helpful to break up the hand into two parts, the palm and the fingers. So if we draw a dividing line, just imagine that this palm actually is kind of just this big square. We see this big blocky square. And then that's bisecting the hand down the middle. And then this top area is going to contain our fingers, right? It's almost one shape divided equally in half. And then obviously from there, you can break up that top shape into 4 sections, and that creates our finger separation. And then that bottom shape, if you kind of draw a line straight up through the middle and then curve it over and then out about the middle of that bottom shape, that's going to be generally the line of that thumb, the bulb of that thumb that kind of comes out. So we've already figured out how do we measure the whole hand together, and that is just, half of it is fingers, half of it is palm generally. That's especially true, it's easiest to see, I should say, on the inside of the hand. Now on the back of the hand over here, we can start to measure fingers. So if we go from one knuckle all the way to the end of the finger, draw a line all the way through that, and then cut that line in half, that's where the first knuckle of our finger is going to be. And you cut this top line in half, that's typically where the second knuckle is going to be. So that's a good way to check to see if your fingers are the right length. Sometimes they might feel a little bit longer or too short in some cases. If you divide up your fingers that way, then you should get these arcs across all of the bones, all the joints in your hands as you go. So as that arc gets closer to the fingertips, it becomes increasingly more severe. And so that's kind of a good way to sort of measure yourself. Speaking about articulation, all of the fingers obviously articulate from the tips of, or the tip of the palm, more or less. But it's important to note, and the reason I brought this sculpt in over here on the right is to show that that thumb has a little bit more of a complex articulation, right? It actually articulates down from the wrist, where the whole hand bends along this axis. That's where the first articulation point of that thumb is. And the second being usually that first kind of visible knuckle that we see. And then, of course, this last point on the thumb. It's important to note also that the thumb swings on a different axis than the other fingers do. It kind of runs at a 90-degree difference from the main fingers of the hand. Forward, I want to show a couple examples of what not to do. No. So I did a quick search for hand models on a really popular 3D modeling site, and just within a couple minutes, I found all of these things. And we won't go through each one of these and say specifically what's wrong with each one. I think it's pretty apparent. But the point here being that if you don't use reference and you're not measuring things out and comparing your work to real life, then your hand is going to look strange for a variety of different reasons. So in this class, I don't want to see any like weird cottage cheese palms. I don't want to see inflated glove look. I don't want to see hands that have no detail in the palm at all and the fingers are totally detailed out. Nothing that looks like a glove that's just totally deflated and like down on the bottom left that's getting very very blocky because there's no variation in the sharpness of the edges or anything like that. And those fingernails feel very pasted on. So just look at your concept first and foremost, and then fall back on some of that anatomical reference that I know you've been saving up for this class, and use it because it'll come in handy. It'll tell you what to do. Here's some really great hand examples from Norman LeMay. This is from his website, 100 Tuesday Tips, or grizzandnorm.com. And I really like the way that Norm breaks down the way that hands work, the action of the hands, and some tips on how to simplify drawing them. And all this stuff is very applicable to 3D. In fact, I find that anytime you're looking for probably like the clearest way to communicate something in 3D is look at a story artist or someone who draws comics or some sort of sequential art, because these guys are masters of simplifying things and bringing it into, just a very easy to understand shape language for everybody. So yeah, just running through these real quick. I like how Norm points out treating that whole thumb as its own unit and just kind of moving that thing around independent of the fingers, paying close attention to those articulation points. Remember, the thumb articulates from the wrist and then from two other spots along the way. So you kind of get this thumb. I'd say more like that. All right. One other good note from this is the treatment of planing out the fingers. I really like just following along here. He's got one simple plane on the top of the finger and then rounded shape on the bottom, so that from the front that kind of has this flat on the top, rounded on the bottom look to it. And if you don't have any information for your hands for your concept, start there and then add detail as needed. It's also important to note that the hand is an extension of the arm and therefore the pose and the character in general. So the hand always has its own line of action as well, and it should be treated as such. If your hand has its own kind of separate thing going on, especially when we get into posing, and we will talk about this a little bit more, then it can feel disconnected or tacked onto the whole body. And that's definitely not what we want. Hands are very, very powerful tools for indicating and for gesturing, and we want to keep them as such. One really important thing that Norm talks about here is grouping fingers, so that you're not always just constantly, doing this with every hand, where you've just got 5 fingers that are doing pretty much like outstretched all the time, or usually you tend to gesture the most with your thumb and your pointer finger, your index finger. So what do you do with these other guys over here? Well, typically the best thing to do is to group them together in some way. So if I just group all 3 of them, we're doing something like that. This just simplifies the hand overall, and it's a good way to kind of treat it. So when we're posing our characters, in general, try to keep those things grouped as much as possible. Remember, we're treating the hand as a whole complete unit all together as one shape that is sort of unique and interesting in its own. Here's a really great hand sheet from Bruce Timm. I think this was for the animated series of Batman, but I really just like the way that he goes in here and breaks down. He's keeping all of our shape language terminology alive in here. We've got tapered shapes, where this is going from wide to small all the way through. We've got, a lot of straights versus curves on all this stuff, but I really like the way he'll, like for example on this fist, get rid of the stair stepping in favor of just a really smooth overall shape. And we get that taper along that plane of the knuckles there. So this is another good piece of art that I like to keep up when I'm working. Even if I'm not specifically working on a character that has hands as simple as this, there's a lot of really good strength and simplicity type of notes that you can pick up from looking at stuff like this, especially from someone like Bruce Timm, who really knows, how to communicate this type of thing. Let's jump back to Flynn. So this is another great, Flynn's got a little bit more anatomical detail, but I really like the way they handle sort of the meatiness of his arms and his hands. Again, a lot of really nice straight versus curve. I like this sort of compression shapes that they're getting as this hand squashes down. What happens to the meat of that hand? It kind of gets pushed up, and we get this bulb on the outside of the finger there. You can see that in a lot of these drawings. And once again, these are all being treated as one kind of solid shape. Like, just look at the silhouette of this hand. It's very easy to read. Can you imagine, if I undo that real quick, can you imagine if, he had decided to stick this pinky off the side? It would kind of create, it would definitely create a sense of like what is going on with this hand pose. It's very hard to read all of a sudden. So I just really like how self-contained these hands look. It's another good reference that I like to keep up. Talk about range of motion in the hand. Let's get into some dynamic hands now. Hands have a huge range of motion, obviously. There's lots of articulation points in there. And, so this is like a fully flexed hand, and those fingers start to bend backward at a certain point. And, there's just really a long ways that it can go. Here we've got the hand closed, obviously, the fist. There's the compressing and expanding of the hand is very important, being able to show how those masses shift around, how those fingers are going to come together. Go back to that last slide just real quick. Typically when a hand's fingers closes, they don't just go straight up and down like this. They have a tendency to go inwards towards the center point. So all of this stuff is going to close inward. And that's why when we get to a fist, all of these fingers seem to be pointing, kind of on an inward direction because they're all curling in towards the center of the palm. So keep that in mind too. Not everything is just straight up and down. These kinds of sheets also are great for just doing some practice. Um, Bust out a piece of paper and just try to copy some of these hand poses if you get a chance. It's it sounds like kind of tedious work and not as fun and exciting as jumping into ZBrush and sculpting, but man, you can learn so much from trying to draw volumetric shapes that are complex like a hand, and it'll definitely feed back into your 3D work at some point down the road. Let's look at some actual 3D hands now. Kind of going back to Bruce Timm territory. This is a really, really nice, in my opinion, Harley Quinn sculpt that I have. So I took some photos of this real quick to show not only two really nice hands, but two kind of different hands on the same figure, which I thought was interesting. And I was thinking about why they chose to do this. And so on the left here, we've got this hand with very sort of spiky fingers. Check out that finger grouping. You see that they've grouped the two fingers in the middle. It makes this whole hand much more easy to read. But those fingers come down to a very nice taper. It's a very simple shape. And then over here on the right, we have a hand that's being much more utilized, right? It's got to hold something. All those fingers are kind of cocked at different angles and directions, so that, keeping these fingers at different angles keeps this hand very interesting. But then one really cool thing is they've gone through and just squared off the back of the hand. There's just a plane on the back and then a plane over here on the side, and all of that is just bent nicely up into that arm, or it's implied underneath this poofy thing. But yeah, two totally different hands actually, but the actual amount of detail and the sharpness of them comes into play depending on what the hand is doing. Another nice example of sculpture at work here is this Kent Melton sculpted Fred Moore girl, is what it's called. And you can see there's this really nice direction change in the form right here at the wrist, where there's a very readable but soft break in that wrist. And you can see it kind of breaks. Not only is the wrist bending a little bit, but it's also kind of changing the direction of that hand, which just keeps things interesting. So not everything is straight up and down. And even though all of these fingers are kind of splayed at the same interval, they're all spaced pretty evenly apart, you can see from the side view over here that there's enough visually different directions happening in those fingers that it still keeps everything interesting and not stagnant. So just really good example of how this whole form is one continuous sweep all the way down the arm with interesting breaks in the directionality as we go. Variation. So it's, there's a lot of students in this class and everyone's going to be choosing a different type of design. So it's really hard to predict the needs of every single character's hands because they're all going to be so varied and unique. But that's why we talk about these general sort of approaches to measuring things out and being able to determine, the proportions of your character's hand based on some general set of rules. So you're not just totally in the dark. But, the more you sculpt hands, the more you'll sort of get a good feel for how they should look and how they might be different on different characters. It becomes kind of second nature. Here's a bunch of cool Milt Kahl Disney style hands. I think all of these are kind of from Sword in the Stone, if I'm not mistaken. But I really like the way that Milt Kahl tends to draw his hands. It's kind of got this chunky finger feeling. One of the most important takeaways here is as he draws a finger, the backside of the finger is always these straighter sort of planes, these very defined uh, breaks in these lines. And then the inside of that finger is going to have more curvature to it. It's going to be our softer part typically. And so that really goes a long ways towards the expressiveness of those fingers. If we take a look at like this drawing over here, he's drawn the spine of that finger as this segmented kind of chunk, and then the inside of that finger is coming up. It's just one simple solid line all the way through. He's got that line to indicate where the knuckles are. And then the only other real indication of the planarity of the top of this finger is how wide he draws that fingernail. We can see from indications like this that he's thinking of the top of that finger as this curved sort of plane like that. And then we've got a rounded underside. This is like the cross section of that finger. If I were to just draw that dead on, we get something like this. So we're not getting fingers that are complete circles, and we're not getting fingers that are complete squares all the way through. Here's some Rafiki hands. This is a great example of how the hand becomes an extension of the arm and really, goes a long way towards being very gestural. That whole unit is working together as one to get what he's saying across. And there's just lots of nice long sweeps of curves going all the way down the arm and then all the way through into the fingers. And another kind of cool thing that happens, especially in animation, is his fingers get longer or wider depending on the emphasis. If you look at that finger compared to this finger, he's sweeping this hand across this way and then pointing, and so that finger gains some actual mass and weight to it to overemphasize what he's actually trying to emote. There's some baby hands that I found. That's a really fun exploration here of just kind of different looking hands. If you get a chance to draw some baby hands, you should definitely try it. They're very fun. And, that's just cool because we're seeing a lot of that structure disappears underneath the just layers and layers of fat and mass on top of that hand. But, all of the same principles still apply here. It's just hidden underneath. You can get away with kind of making things very balloony and poofy. Let's do a quick overview of feet, the hands of the legs, as far as I'm concerned. So I've already said everything that you need to know about shape and form. So we just need to apply that to the feet. All right, lecture over. No, let's go in a little bit more deep than that. Talking about just how the foot is constructed in a general sense. So there's a huge area of the foot that doesn't articulate a whole lot. It doesn't really articulate until we get to obviously the toes, right? And the toes start to articulate kind of around this area. But generally the foot is a wedge shape. Woo, there's our foot. But with the one, in some cases your character might have an added bump in that wedge to account for that bone that kind of sticks up there. I don't know the names of all these things, but I don't spend a ton of time having to memorize that stuff. Generally a cursory look at some foot anatomy when I get to sculpting is all I kind of need, because we're going to probably simplify the foot a lot more than it would be for a realistic character. This is a really nice example of simplifying that foot. This is a Devil Planet Studio sculpture that I found on Instagram, I think. And I really like the way that they've overemphasized this bony ridge in the foot and then also pushed that heel out quite a bit. So just taking the few parts of the foot that really have a recognizable structure to them, something that's just like, what really are the pieces that you think of when you think of a foot? You always think of this bulbous kind of heel and then this wedge shaped front of the foot. And they've really just overemphasized that a lot, made it feel really nice. I also really like the way that the backside, or like the underside, I should say, of this foot has this really just flat plane. It's kind of cool. So a little bit more geometric of a look to this foot, but just a really nice, I'll clear my marks from here so that you can see, but just a really good breakdown of that foot in general. Like I said, most of your characters probably wearing shoes, or the feet might be very, very simplified, but it's still important to be able to think about how these feet are made and how they should read when you look at them. Here's just a really quick breakdown of construction of a foot. So always think about your feet in, just like with the hands, as one sort of simple shape. So if I'm thinking of my foot more or less like this shape, and then if I break that down into planes, breaking out those planes again so that nothing is totally symmetrical. I've got one break higher than the other, and then I'm leaving an area for where the feet or the toes start to articulate. And then I'm just trying to make things interesting. So I've got my curve on the inside, straight on the outside, and then this bulb of the heel right here. And then obviously we break up this top toe part into sections for the toes. And then I've got my more kind of realized drawing of the toe here. So this might be trending towards a little bit more realistic than I would go for most characters, but it's just a thought exercise in how I would go about planing that foot out and kind of breaking it down into simple shapes. One last quick note on the feet before we move on. I don't want to see any tube socks in your feet, so it's very easy to move on to more exciting parts of the body and work on things that, are a little bit more visible and kind of the fun parts of our character, but the feet are still very important. Feet and hands are always going to be super important. So, make sure that you spend some time getting them to look right. Keeping those feet interesting along lines of articulation is going to be key. So here on this bent foot, you can see I've got, a more angled, defined plane break where that foot bends. And then on the other side, it's a softer, but still pretty defined, rounded edge. I don't want to see any of this kind of uniform, soft bend all the way through the foot. It's just not going to sell that foot as being planted on the ground or well sculpted. So that's my spiel on hands and feet for this week. I'm going to jump into the demo now, and we'll talk specifically about how we're going to approach sculpting hands and feet for this class. So here we are back in ZBrush, and we're ready to get working on our hand. So you'll remember from the previous weeks when I blocked in my whole body, I ended up using a hand that I already had. And that's because it's got topology that works well for me, and I like, the setup that's in here. It's not the right shape yet, but that's fine. We'll be doing that now. So there's obviously lots of different ways to approach doing a hand. You can start with good existing topology, or you can sculpt it up from scratch if you like, do a Dynamesh process like we already showed. It doesn't really matter how you get to this hand. But what I want you to do is skip any unnecessary work if you don't have to do it. So if you don't already have a hand laying around, that's okay. We can start with Super Average Man from the ZBrush default tools. And that you can find just if you hit the comma button, you'll bring up this light box here. And go to the tool palette, Super Average Man. So if you grab him, he's got a hand that's already, not perfect, but it's a pretty good start. And we can modify it to be a little bit better for ourselves. He's also got a foot that you can just jack and take that for your character too if you don't already have a foot. These are really good places to start with these. And, if you don't already have something lined up or you don't have the time to Dynamesh build a hand from scratch, then I really recommend just going in and cutting off about that much of a hand. So I'll just go ahead and delete hidden on that. Then we can make a couple different modifications to this hand to make it a little easier to sculpt with. You'll notice that there's some subdivisions already in the fingers. So if I subdivide this up, actually I'm just going to divide just to see what's going on. We get really a lot of subdivisions now in the finger, which is fine. We might want to add that amount later, but for now, let's just make it easier for ourselves. So what I'm going to do is go into the Z modeler, and then the default is going to be insert edge loop. If I hover over an edge, it'll say insert edge loop. And that's fine, that's what I want. So what I'm going to do is delete every single span in these fingers that isn't a knuckle. So it's like every other span. Okay. Here's my knuckle, delete that. There's a knuckle. Alright, something like that. I'll do the same thing on the thumb. Actually, the thumb I'll just leave. So now if I do a divide on this, show you the wireframe, you'll see that it's much, much more simple. And this is actually going to be my new base. I want to start from about this resolution because we're going to be sculpting. And so, now if I've got this resolution, I can delete lower subdivisions because I'm going to go back in here with ZRemesher now and add those holding spans to my knuckles. So BZM for ZRemesher. I'm going to add 2 spans on either side of each knuckle. Okay, whoops. Like that. So each knuckle is going to be 2 spans. And then there'll be 1 span in the middle of the finger. And then we'll get 2 more spans. And then another span and then the nail. Looks like I forgot to delete a span. So just clean that up to the level that you want. Maybe slide some stuff around. Something like that. Alright, so now the next thing I want to do is get my polygroups going. So whether or not you're using my method here to make this hand work for you, or if you're starting with your own topology, give this a shot to get some usable polygroups. So this is going to come in handy a lot when we start to sculpt this hand out and when we start to pose this hand especially. So the first thing that I'll do is get my lasso select, and I'm just going to hide the tips of these fingers. invert my selection, and then grow these all the way down to the hand base right there, so where they're still separate objects. And then I'm going to polygroup all. So I've got different polygroups. Shrink my selection down, polygroup all, shrink, shrink for a knuckle, polygroup, shrink, shrink, polygroup, shrink, shrink, polygroup. So now what I've got is all of my knuckle spans here are a separate polygroup, and then all of the finger spans in between are separate. This allows for really easy topological masking, or if I want to just work on this part or just work on this part, it's really quick and easy now to grab these individual pieces. And you can polygroup out these nails a little bit too if you want to. One thing I might do is go ahead and add another span inside of these nails just to give us some, enough topology that we can work with an embedded nail. Alright, so with that we're ready to get started sculpting on our hand. Alright, now we're back over to my hand, and I did the same kind of polygrouping that I did on the demo guy hand. There's a couple of differences in topology that I'll talk about just real quick so that you can understand my reasoning. First is that I took out the fingernails for this character because I don't need them. She's going to be wearing gloves, so I don't need to have that extra detail. I don't even want to deal with it. The next is that all of my fingers have got a couple extra spans in the middle parts between the knuckles, and that's just for more control over the shape. I'm probably going to sculpt the hand low res so that it subdivides, easily, and I'm not relying too much on sculptural detail for holding edges. That's just my personal preference, especially because I know that I'm going to want to go in here and be able to tweak the angle of fingers and stuff like that. So, the lower res I can keep it, the more control I'll have. That's just the way that I like to work for hands specifically. And that's about it. So I'm going to kind of do some overall proportion work on this hand, and then I'm going to go in and do one finger, and then from there we can, break that finger off and duplicate it over to these other ones so that we're not sculpting the same finger over and over. You certainly can do that if you want to. And then we'll go and clean it up, and the hand will be done and ready. So let's go ahead and do that now. Alright, so just like before, I've created a new spotlight set of references here that I can use, and I've arranged them around my canvas a little bit, so I might be popping that up here and there. So I've got my concept art up, of course, for general proportions of these hands. She's got pretty meaty hands, so these male hand references are going to be pretty useful. And yeah, so have that reference ready to go whenever you need it. Right, move this down, scale it up. Nice. So now I've got all that stuff in here. All right, so just to get started here, I'm going to start just pushing stuff around, and we'll go from there. Push that thumb out some. So overall width. This hand is feeling a little narrow. So remember that wedge shape. The hand is going to be slightly thicker towards the base of the hand, especially over here with this thumb bulb. All of these fingers are going to be a little wider too. Kind of do the thumb. Thinking about whether or not I need to square off the edges of these fingers some. Ideally, I'm not going to sculpt a hand that goes inside the glove and then the glove on top of that. Got to think about what the final result will be, and don't overextend yourself doing work that isn't going to be seen or isn't going to pay off in some way. For some of you, if you have access to another modeling app, something like Maya or Modo, it might be quicker to do some of these hand edits in a program like that. Sometimes I feel like the brush interface in ZBrush can be slow, for if you're trying to do, pretty low res polygon detailing, but I kind of also like the way that it feels, so I tend to work in ZBrush as much as I can. So one of the benefits of keeping your hand low res is you can just jump into this smooth preview here to kind of check how everything's looking. I'm liking that level of rounding off on these fingers. Everyone's characters are going to be very different, so some characters are going to have really rounded off fingers. Some characters will have really squared off fingers, and some characters will have fingers that just really taper down elegantly to a point. So, adjust accordingly. Your results will be different than mine. And I'm feeling like that hand or this thumb is really sticking out a lot. This week is all going to be pretty much time spent. So, there's not a really quick and easy way that I have found to sculpt a really good hand. So you'll have to just put in some time and be patient with it. Just work on one piece at a time until it starts to come together. Pulling these spans together in areas where I want to make more of an emphasis or a break. See what the result of that is when I go into the smooth preview here. Feels pretty good. Alright, let's move on to the rest of these proportions for this hand. So if you remember that Bruce Timm hand breakdown, I really love that idea of that sweep of the knuckles that he has on there. So I'm gonna try and keep something like that in mind, some sort of line that connects these knuckles all together. And just think of that more of like not so much a line that's going to be drawn directly on top or sculpted in some way, but a general kind of sweep is nice to have in there. And some, that's kind of the line of action that these knuckles are going to be laid on. Kind of ignoring the wrist right now. It feels very stuck way off over here, so that's something I'll adjust as I go. Let's pull that over a little bit. All right, one thing comes to mind is the arc. So obviously our fingers on the back of the hand move in an arc like this across the top of the hand. They're not all just perfectly straight across. Something I could work on a little bit still with this hand, but also from the front we're going to get an arc that does this. You can look at your own hand, you'll see that it does not totally flatten out on the top of the hand. There is some interesting arcing happening there. So do that. And then something that I want to keep in mind always when I'm sculpting is how this hand is looking in silhouette. If I've got the break of my wrist down here, and that kind of comes down into the hand. Just use this cut brush here. Alright, so there's a breaking point in my wrist, and then this swoop down into the hand like that. I don't want to make sure I'm not getting like too much of this kind of thing going on that's way over exaggerated, but the idea is to have a clean silhouette that's easily readable. So if you're looking at your hand sculpt and everything is very, very wobbly, take a break and smooth some stuff out. It'll start to feel better. Alright. So my fingers on this character are going to have a little bit of taper to them, but not a ton. Maybe I'll detail out this middle finger. This is the longest and therefore the most important finger. But my hand, my fingers are going to be pretty square and pretty straight. Not a lot of taper to those. And it's important that I kind of figure out a balance because I want to make sure that they're not totally parallel and straight either. Actually, this cross section is a good time to talk about how the fingers connect into the palm of the hand. So if you look at your hand from the top, your hand, your fingers appear to be slightly longer. And if you look at your hand from the bottom, your fingers are a little bit shorter looking. And that's because they attach to the palm at this sort of angle, right? There's a triangular sort of attachment point, and this pad of the fingers on the inside of the palm is further up than the knuckles are. By knuckles, I mean the rotation point of the fingers. You know where that knuckle actually rotates. So that's what causes those fingers to feel a little bit shorter from the bottom. So just, make sure that your fingers aren't just stuck in at a totally perpendicular angle to the rest of the hand. And they have just a little bit of a swoop, this triangular kind of shape in the webbing here. In fact, that's kind of what creates that webbing. I think that's a good rule of thumb for pretty much any stylized character, even if you have very, very simple hands. Don't completely square off everything. Remember the bad hand examples that I showed? Those are good examples of just sticking on fingers. Everything needs to learn to live together nicely. Like a little bit of bowing on the back of the hand there. I think that that's just a nice contrast, and we get sort of an S curve shape with the break of the wrist in there as well. All right, let's finish detailing out this middle finger. Just pulling stuff around till I get it where I want it. I've got some weird janky skewing happening. Some of my knuckles. The polygroup coloring is really the most important part for me of polygrouping these fingers, because it helps me differentiate things. Like, keep landmarks for yourself. I think that that's really, really important and helpful. If I know that this span is always going to be where that finger creases from, then it gives me a guideline. It's like the sketch for my finger. I'm going to go ahead and insert another edge loop down here towards the end so I can get a nice square off on that finger. Alright, so just like our knuckles all have an arc to them and an interesting look, it's not just flat, our fingers should be the same. So these fingers, typically your fingers are going to be a little bit flatter on the top and then rounded on the bottom side of those fingers. And if you remember those Milt Kahl hand explorations that I showed, he always had very straight planes on the back of the hand going to each knuckle, right? So here's a really strong flat plane, back of his hand, goes to this knuckle, and then another straight line that goes to this knuckle, and then we might go straight or maybe vary it up a little bit on this last part of this digit. Let's see what that looks like. Right, so really readable straight lines on the back of that hand. Be careful not to make it look too skeletal. If you really have kind of too much curvature happening between these knuckles, it starts to look kind of skeletal and weird. Right now mine is approaching that, so I'm going to go back and make sure that in between each knuckle it's as straight as can be without too much dip down. And this is why we want to duplicate our fingers and move them around, because you're already sculpting two sides of a finger. You don't want to do that for every single finger. Alright, so that feels pretty good. What's happening on the back of that finger. And then if you'll also remember from that same set of drawings, those Milt Kahl hand explorations, very straight on the backs of the fingers, and then kind of tapered, not tapered, but softened on the insides of the fingers. So I might get a little bit of a heavier weight down here towards the end of the finger, and then just sculpting this whole length of the finger to have a nice simple curve, or interesting curve, but the whole bottom of this is devoid of those faceting breaks that the top of the finger has. That tip was feeling a little too square. Just push those points apart. Alright, finger's feeling okay. I think that there's definitely some more finesse work that we could do. I don't know if I love for this character to have a completely smooth inside of this finger. So, I might go in and take advantage of this low res to push some spans in, pull some stuff together, and get some breakup going on in there. I want to be careful I don't do too much of that because she is wearing gloves. I don't want it to just feel like she's wearing brown hands on top of her other hands. So there's going to be a detail threshold. Once I get the bare bones of this stuff in here, I can go in and sculpt up extra, detail like sharpness on the top plane of the fingers and anything like that. Extra wrinkles if you're doing gloves. Anything like that can be added later. Alright, here's one thing I'm just noticing. So if I take a look at this span here, that's what's defining the sharpness of the top plane of my hand. It gets pretty close, pretty tight over here on this side. And over here on this side, it really falls away a lot. So I'll just bring this up, bring it closer together. This is basic polygon modeling, obviously. The closer your edges are, the tighter or sharper your crease is going to be. And that leaves these three spans on the bottom to round everything out. I'm going to try adding a little bit more anatomical detail to this finger by making this first knuckle in the finger here the widest point of the whole finger. Not by a comically exaggerated amount, but just a little bit. And then tediously clean up the area around it. If you feel more comfortable diving into a Dynamesh object and sculpting all this stuff instead of moving one point at a time like I do, then by all means do it. There's no wrong way to sculpt a finger or a hand as long as it looks right in the end. But I like this method because it just gives me precise control. I come from old school modeling, so I'm used to jumping into some package like a Maya and just moving verts around and kind of knowing what's going to happen then if I subdivide. Alright, that finger's feeling pretty decent to me. I'm going to keep going on it though, because nothing's ever done. And then where I have this crease here, I'm just going to bring out these spans on either side of that crease. Give me a little bit more flesh or bulgy feeling, so that crease doesn't just feel like an isolated line in the middle of a shape. My hand topology here is fairly simple, so you'll notice I don't do anything like cap off this crease or something like that. I don't kite that out because it doesn't matter a whole lot when I start to subdivide this, and I can always go in and sculpt on the high res version of this hand later to finesse little things like that. I typically won't spend any time detailing on a hand until I've got it into pose, because it's going to get mangled as we start to move stuff around. And so, knowing that, I just try to get it as clean and workable as I can at this stage. Try something here. Like, what if I had a really sharp knuckle break there? Kind of use that to control this wavy line of the knuckles. Kind of like the idea of that. Obviously, I'm getting like some weird roundness, but I like the idea of that. Get it to work. If I soften this out. Yeah, I think we could get a cool plane on the top of this hand that'll work well for me. Yeah, so maybe these edge loops on these knuckles weren't the best idea for this type of hand. The idea was to get, some versatile knuckles, but kind of fighting them a little bit here, and then just flattening and finessing this silhouette again, so it doesn't look like my character has these huge arthritic knuckles. Alright, so remember those default lines that are in almost every hand? I went ahead and built in one of those right here. I guess two, really, if you count this thumb line. Then we've got this line that's in almost every hand, and then we've got this other line that comes across like that. So we're going to go a little bit more simple than that, not even that level of detail on this particular character. Alright, just finessing this junction point now a little bit, where the finger actually connects into the rest of the hand, both on top and bottom. And I'd say I've got a pretty decent finger that I can go with for now. I'll show you one thing real quick. If you do have a character that's not wearing gloves, which is probably most of you, duplicate this off, and let's take a look at possibly inserting a thumbnail. So if you don't already have topology for a thumbnail, you can add it by using the Z modeler. And I'm just going to alt click on these squares and then hover over a face and choose inset. My target is going to be polygon or polygroup island. And let's see, center and border, border only, or center only. Let's try insert region, center only. Okay, so that deletes the outside. So center and border. Yep, that's what we want. That's like a straight up extrude. I'm going to do that one more time, and then that should give me a good start. So let's push this stuff kind of into the shape of a fingernail. No, probably wouldn't have as squared off of a finger as I do. So now we're going to use this top plane as the nail that we actually see. We're going to need more topology here, but let's just work with what we got until we need to add it. So I'm going to push this side down, and that's going to be kind of our recessed part of our nail. And that's going to go from inside to outside. So you can see that's starting to take shape when I divide that a little bit. So now what we need is this overlap and undercut of this nail. And to do that, I'm just going to add another span. So go back to Z modeler, and I'm going to insert an edge loop right here. I'm also going to polygroup this so that I can easier see the thickness of this nail and the arc of it. So let's say that that's the edge of my nail. This point I'm going to drag underneath, as well as this point and this point. Probably getting the idea. So drag that underneath. And we're getting something that looks like a fingernail. And this is looking a little bit flat right here when I subdivide it. So if I pull that point out, maybe pull this point out, get that overlap. It's kind of a reversal of planes that are happening, but they happen underneath everything else, kind of out of sight, so that's nice. Yeah, so if I did the same thing over here that I already did here, it's going to start to look like a pretty decent fingernail, and I can shape that however I want, and it's just built into my hand. So that's how I would do fingernails on a character that has them. Alright, I'm going to throw that right in the garbage and go back to my glove hand here. So the next thing I'm going to do is copy this finger shape over to these other fingers. You can do that in ZBrush or in another program, and then we'll jump back and finish up this hand. Alright, here I am back in ZBrush. So I took my hand to another program, and I chopped off that middle finger and duplicated it around, and then just bridged it back into the hand, into the palm. So you'll see that I've got a couple areas in here where the spans are a little bit wonky and kind of stretched, and that's just because the polygons are stretching to fit where I placed the finger roughly in space. So now I've got, topology on my hand is working. I've got a finger that's close to the shape that I think I want to go with. And now all I have to do is just sculpt this up. So, now I'm just going to go around the hand and, try to define some planes that are important to me that I want to keep. So here's this arc of the knuckles. Maybe I'll go a little bit more complex than this sort of simple arc, but that's a good starting point. Keeping the arc of these knuckles arched a little bit like that, and not flat across. It's going to be important. I probably will go and maybe sharpen up the top planes of these fingers just a little bit to get a break there. It's important with hands to every once in a while just step back and take a look at how they are reading from far away. And putting in these heavier plane breaks is sometimes useful for that. There's a lot of characters that are going to have more simple hands, that aren't going to necessarily benefit from having these kinds of plane breaks in their hands, and that's fine. So, I mean, you're going to have to kind of use your best judgment to determine if this sort of thing will be useful for your character. So as I'm putting these kinds of breaks in, usually wherever there's a articulation point in the hand, so along these knuckles here, and then just the general sort of planes of the hand as I go. Also, as I work on the hand, you see I've got my subdivisions in here. Anytime I need to make a broad stroke change, I'll always go down to a lower subdivision and then start to shape, for instance, this finger. Maybe I want to do a little bit more complex or interesting of a shape. Start with a lower subdivision. And if you need to do things like scale up your hand or scale up a finger, like maybe this thumb needs a rotation, I'll do that on a lower subdivision level because it's easier to control fewer polygons, right? That's the whole point of having the subdivisions in the first place. All right, and then when I'm ready to add detail or continue sculpting, I'll go back up a couple subdivisions. Most of my sculpting is being done on subdivision level 2 for the hands, because that starts to give me a little bit of an idea of what this is going to look like smoothed, but I can still get a lot of work done on fewer polygons. And then just stepping up to higher subdivisions. All right, so now I'm going to go about just kind of shaping this hand and getting these fingers to feel like they all belong. All this stuff is feeling a little bit wonky right now and segmented on the fingers. So the goal is to get these fingers feeling very, just a little bit more kind of character and life to them. They feel a little bit like 3 marshmallows on a stick at the moment. So I'm going to just jump in and start sculpting. And eventually I'll end up with something like this. So this is going to be my final hand sculpt for this character for now. Without getting into the pose that we'll be in, but just something that kind of fits the style of the character, I think, and is a good enough hand for now that I can pose this and not really have to worry too much about what the design is going to be like later. So I just want to go over some of the big things that I did on this hand in between now and when we last showed it, right before I kind of jumped in and did all my main sculpting here. So the first thing that you'll notice is I've decided on a very particular shape and flow to these fingers. All right, so I've got a, from the knuckle to the first digit, the first knuckle on that finger is, I've got this kind of an arc, like a sweep. And then I reverse that at the first digit, and I kind of ignore that second digit. It's implied with a little bit of a bend that's happening in that finger. The goal of that arc is to get a finger that doesn't feel too segmented out. You remember that my previous hand was just feeling like a couple of marshmallows that were stacked on top of each other like this, which is fine for some characters maybe, but I wanted to get, the meatiness of this hand without losing all of the femininity of it and having some sort of grace to the hand. And I think that these fingers are going to look pretty good when they're clenched into like a fist or holding onto something. And then all this other stuff is going to kind of wrap a little more soft. All right, so just changing up the shape of fingers as they go along the length of them. And then the next thing that you'll probably want to include in your own hand is I thought about this hand as sort of one piece overall, like composition kind of by itself. And, it's not perfect, but one of the things I thought about was what does this look like in silhouette? And so as I rotate around this hand, I just want to make sure that I'm not getting any weird silhouettes from any one particular angle, that it's pretty readable. And all of my plane breaks, when I rotate around, we take a look at like this plane break, for example. If I rotate around to the side, when that plane break becomes part of this silhouette, I want to make sure that it reads really nicely. Okay, so like if I take a look at this knuckle line here, if I rotate that around to here, I want to just make sure that that line is reading fairly well and there's not a lot of bumpiness, going on. That every arc and every line break is very intentional, so I've got a break that goes along this side of the palm here, but it's faded out just a little bit. I didn't feel like it needed to be as sharp as this one that I've got going along the top of the hand. So just making little choices like that. I chose to really simplify the interior anatomy. So remember, we've got a main crease that kind of goes like this on almost every hand, another crease that kind of does this on every hand, and we've got the bulb of the thumb there. So now I've just included the thumb and then this sort of interior palm shape that helps just, solidify this as a hand. I haven't included any fingernails on this character because she's going to be wearing gloves, so it just kind of redundant to sculpt that. But we covered that in the last little section there. So yeah, that's just kind of some of the main stuff I was looking at. A couple things about articulation in the hand. If you take a look at where the wrist is going to bend, typically up here on the top of the wrist is, it's going to feel a little further forward than the articulation point on the bottom of the wrist, because this whole thing is going to bend, kind of hinge from up there, as we bend the wrist, bend the whole hand. And the same thing is kind of true of the finger joints too. So make sure that, there's a little bit of an offset between where they bend on the top and where we see them crease on the inside. And not everything is totally parallel. So let's see. What else can I say about this hand? So even, hands are something that you can just tweak forever and ever and ever. So at a certain point, you got to say, I'm done with you for now, hand, and then move on to the other body pieces, because this hand is going to change a lot when we get into sculpting the pose. So, the goal for this week is just to get your hand in a place where you're ready to pose it. It feels like it belongs to this character. All your proportions and things are worked out, and we can finish it up. If I was doing a production character, at this point it would be pretty easy to neutralize his hand and have it ready to go for rigging. And it wouldn't be a huge amount of work to do because I've given myself these handy polygroups, which are making things easily selectable. Alright, so that's it. This is my final hand for this character. I know that I'm going to be slapping a glove onto this hand later, so there's a certain amount of detail that I'm leaving out, but this is more than enough for the majority of characters that we're going to be making. And yeah, just remember that we're going to jump in and put this into a pose pretty soon. So, things are going to change. It doesn't have to be completely perfect, but all my proportions are worked out, and it's looking good enough for me for now. All right, let's talk about homework this week. So, this being the hand and foot week, it's important that we get our hands and feet sculpted all the way up, get them feeling unique and connected to our character like they're all part of the same design. Spend some good time and love on these hands and make them feel really special because they're a big part of the character, and they're going to be missed if they're overlooked or if they feel like an afterthought. So really put some time in and learn a lot. Hands are something that are very tricky. Hands are, like I said, a character into themselves, so let's make them feel that way. And then we're ready to start adding all of our accessories and stuff next week. So you want to be make sure that all of the pieces we've sculpted of this body so far are feeling good. And that's it. So yeah, sculpt up our hands and feet, make them feel nice, and we'll see you next week.